Okay, so this is a talk on the role and perception of expertise in policymaking with some reference to the COVID-19 pandemic. What I'm going to talk about, I'm going to set the scene a bit to start with. So we'll start with a discussion of what is expertise, the difference between knowledge and wisdom. And in this case, I'll be defining wisdom as to do with normative judgments, whereas knowledge is to do with objective facts. Talk a bit about what rationality in policymaking means, and then talk a little bit about what technocracy means. And then having set the scene with these concepts, we can then go on to talk about science and democracy in rational policymaking, and then about COVID-19 and what it means for expertise in public policy. And in particular, I will address the hope of many technocrats or would-be technocrats that COVID-19 is, in a sense, the revenge of the experts, an opportunity for them to get back in the driver's seat and return to the heyday of the sort of 1980s when technocrats made a lot of really critical decisions. Fortunately, I don't think, well, maybe fortunately, in any case, I don't think this is what's going to happen. All right, so what is an expert? So when I give talks like this, one of the first things that I do is I just go on the internet and type in some of the keywords to see if I can find some good images with which I can spice up the slide deck. So I'm going to start with just a few of these images to see whether they trigger anything interesting. So this was one of the first images I hit on, which I thought was a bit odd because it suggests that an expert is some sort of bearded hipster who wears lapel suits and I guess works in tech, something like that. Then I came to this one, which just seems very kind of nonsensical to me. Reminded me a bit of a comment that my girlfriend makes that in contemporary society, people are rewarded if they can bring order out of raw information, regardless of whether that order is actually meaningful in any sort of way or correct for that matter. I stopped on this one because it was one of the only images I saw that was of a woman, which I found quite jarring. And also because it's kind of dumb. What is an expert? Well, an expert is a topic expert. An expert is experienced. An expert is an expert media resource. Well, like, duh, an expert is an expert. Very helpful. All right, so we're not getting anywhere. Then we got to this one, which I thought was really funny. We got consulting. So consultants, experts. So of course, the consulting companies will often present their people as experts, particularly in the management consulting space. But I think often these companies are quite far from expertise and indeed give expertise quite a bad name. Consultants tend to be guns for hire and they can make your data say whatever you want it to say. Indeed, consultants are often hired because someone has an axe to grind and needs to present an independent report that backs up their claims. But are consultants really independent? So, I mean, I could list off dozens of these examples. I collect examples of consultants behaving badly. But one of my favorites is that in Australia, we have this institution called the Productivity Commission, which is a bipartisan government-funded but independent organization full of technocrats, very highly educated, very intelligent people whose job is to provide reports on things that the government is interested in. The Productivity Commission was once asked by the Australian Capital Territory government to provide a cost-benefit analysis of the light rail, or rather of producing a new light rail system or expanding the bus network. And if I remember correctly, the Productivity Commission found that light rail was almost certainly a bad idea. It seemed to have a net present value of less than 1, whereas the bus network had a net present value at least of greater than 1. And there's more to making decisions than just net present value, but certainly in this case, it seems like the bus network is the way to go. Now, the government didn't like that because the government had already politically and ideologically committed to light rail. And so they then commissioned Ernst & Young to do an alternative report, which promptly found a net present value of greater than 1, in part by applying techniques that are sort of inadmissible in cost-benefit analysis, particularly relating to real estate prices. So, I mean, in this context, do we think of the Ernst & Young report as being an independent assessment, or do we think of the Productivity Commission report as the independent assessment? And who do we think has more expertise, or who should we trust in this case? And if we don't trust consultants to provide independent analysis, then who do we trust instead? And one option is, well, maybe we trust experts. So in the wake of the COVID pandemic, a lot of governments have appointed expert advisory boards to explain economic recovery or explain the medical approach. And so you see here the SAGE board, which does have women on it, although it's overwhelmingly men, which is a bit weird. In any case, what we really noticed about the SAGE board is that it's full of academics, full of people whose professional obligation is to be right. And most of our incentives as academics are around being able to demonstrate that you're right and other people are wrong using empirical methods. And you see that here, all these people, Dean of the Faculty of Epidemiology, Professor of Infectious Diseases, etc. So maybe we seem to trust academics when we really need a kind of independent point of view. But maybe academics are also full of it. So just as another example of consultants behaving badly, the Group of 8 in Australia, which is the equivalent of the UK Russell Group or the US Ivy Leagues, just the kind of the top research universities in Australia, a few years ago commissioned Deloitte, if I remember correctly, to calculate the value of higher education in Australia to the economy overall. And they produced a really beautiful 80-page glossy report that calculated, just a huge value, something like $350 billion a year is what higher education contributes through all its research and all the rest of it. Now, one of the funny things about this, and as I remember as an economist, even a junior at that time, just still starting my PhD, I was like, this is weird. Like you'd have to calculate the positive externality associated with education. That's really hard. I mean, literally, the positive externality associated with education is the textbook example of an externality that you cannot quantify. I wonder how they did this. And so I turned to the appendix, which was all of 3 pages at the end of this report. And I remember just kind of laughing my head off about how incredibly shallow that theoretical basis was, and that there's no way that they'd, in a sense, calculated this number. They just plucked it out of thin air. So, okay, consultants behaving badly. And I think I present this report to a lot of my academic colleagues, and they're all like, yeah, this is a joke, consultants suck. But then recently, there were a lot of cuts to higher education in Australia. And lo and behold, a lot of economists, a lot of these junior economists who I'd been commiserating with at the time started to trot out this report. Oh, look, there's this independent consulting report that shows that higher education is worth a lot of money. So it really seems to me like as soon as someone has a vested interest in the outcomes of some sort of research, then they immediately get confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and all the rest of it, and you can't trust them anymore. So then who, again, can we trust to give us an impartial analysis of relevant policy questions? Can we trust technocrats like the board of the US Federal Reserve? So here we have the last 4 board members. These people are often associated with the height of technocracy, dispassionate, technical, scientific analysis of facts. But then, Alan Greenspan, among others, I mean, I'm sure they all have some biases, but Alan Greenspan is kind of well known as being very fond of Ayn Rand's philosophy. And Ayn Rand is hardly a sort of moderate centrist character, hardly dispassionate. And, Ayn Rand's philosophy very much aligns with Greenspan's sort of hands-off kind of method, but not, I think, with his loose monetary policy. But let's not worry too much about that. The point is that even these kind of the highest of the higher technocrats do seem to have their various normative biases. And we see a similar thing with the Australian COVID Commission. A lot of concern that there were no medical experts on this commission, but that's kind of irrelevant because there's a separate body that advises on the medical side. This commission was set up to advise on the economic recovery. And it suggested that there should be a gas-fired recovery. Which, if anyone follows the Australian energy market, is complete nonsense. I won't really get into why, but the real reason why they seem to have suggested a gas-fired recovery is because a lot of the people in this commission were connected to the gas industry. So unsurprisingly, they recommended things that were good for their business, that would help their business bounce back. But it's not clear that that's really a kind of dispassionate assessment of what's best for the Australian economy. So again, it seems like your experts are people who have their own human failings, their own interests, and are always going to recommend things that are in line with their interests. Let's go through a few other examples of people that might be experts. Are the X Factor judges experts? And experts on what? Experts on musical talent, expert on singing, expert on what's going to be commercially viable. What are we trusting these people with? What about the people who run the Great British Bake Off, one of the most successful TV shows in recent history? Are they experts in comedy? Are they experts in cooking? Are they experts in just like hosting a show and keeping it at a good clip? What about athletes? What about Shane Warne? Is he an expert in cricket? Certainly an expert in spin. Is Tony Abbott an expert on trade? So I find this an interesting case, not just to bash on Tony Abbott, but like Tony Abbott has said occasionally some things that make it seem like he doesn't really know what he's talking about trade. Like he sort of suggests things that are I think kind of right in spirit, like just unilaterally dropping trade barriers, but then he phrases it in a Spectator article, for example, as something like Britain should just unilaterally declare reciprocal recognition of tariffs, which is bizarre. You can't unilaterally declare that one of your trading partners will reciprocally recognize your statements. This would certainly contravene WTO law, but it's also just weird. It's like saying, I recognize or I declare that you will recognize what I say. That's obviously not going to work. But it's kind of irrelevant because what his expertise was grounded in, according to the British government, was that he had been part of governments that had shepherded through to signing various free trade agreements around Asia. And so he knew the kind of politics of that or the logistics of that or whatever it might be, and that Britain was going into a period post-Brexit where it was going to need to sign a very large number of trade agreements. And so it needed this kind of expertise. I don't think that's really true either, but I don't know quite enough about the ins and outs of politics and expertise. So who knows? Maybe that was a justified point of view. I'm going to start to be more constructive here and take the piss a bit less and start to think, well, like doctors are something that we associate with expertise. And why is that? So really keep doctors in your head for a while. So you're like, I'm sick, something's wrong with me, I don't know what's going on. I better consult an expert. I'm going to go see the doctor. And usually you don't question what a doctor says. Doctor's like, put this tablet in your mouth 3 times a day. You're like, yep, cool. You don't like, you look at the pack and it's like doxyhydrochloroquine. What is that? You don't know, but you just keep taking it, right? You trust them. Why is it that you trust them? Right? What is it about what kind of expertise do they have? What's the essence of that makes them considered an expert? Are experts just smart people? This tweet doesn't necessarily speak to this. I just think this tweet's really funny because intelligence and wisdom are indeed different. And I think that's one of the really kind of remarkable insights of the Dungeons and Dragons system. Elon Musk, though, I mean, sometimes he's kind of held up as one of these people who's smart, but kind of weird and a bit dumb in other ways, socially awkward at the very least. Other times people think he's actually just lucky and that he's actually not very smart or very wise. But in any case, he's an interesting case where some people think, oh, this guy is just so bright. I can't even possibly understand what he's thinking. I just need to throw money at his companies and I'll make heaps of money myself. And those people often get a bit burned. Anyway, what about then like Gwyneth Paltrow, and what's the relationship between trust and expertise? So Gwyneth Paltrow is making all these beauty products and health and well-being products, some of which you ingest, a lot of which you put on your body. And it doesn't seem to me from my brief viewing of the Netflix series on Goop that they necessarily have kind of scientific protocols around how they do their research. But a lot of people are happy to take her advice and just say, Gwyneth Paltrow says that I should ingest this. So they trust her. Is that because she's an expert or is there something else going on there? All right, let me make a claim because I've been banging on now for a while about what is expertise, but I'm just giving all these examples. Let me state what I think is a kind of useful way to think about expertise, if perhaps not a comprehensive way. So I would say that a useful way to think about expertise, especially in the context of public policy, is that experts are people who are knowledgeable about falsifiable claims, especially empirical claims in a predictive context. So let me just talk about what these words mean. So if I make a claim like Yves Klein was a rubbish artist, which is an opinion that I hold, this is a value judgment rather than an empirical claim, and it's certainly not something that I can falsify. There's no way to sort of experimentally test whether Yves Klein was in fact untalented. Compare that to, and the key thing here is that it's a value judgment, right? It's normative, it's not about facts. Then you have a claim like the Spanish flu disappeared because it became steadily more contagious but less deadly. That's a falsifiable empirical claim. We can go back into the historical record and see whether this is the case. But it's not a predictive claim, right? I can't assume on the basis of what happened in the Spanish flu that the same thing's going to happen with COVID because COVID might be quite a different coronavirus. Then we could say something like decision X is unconstitutional. That's a falsifiable claim, but you don't falsify it so much through empirical analysis as through deduction. So you look at the rules as laid out in the Constitution, you look at some particular decision or some new law, and you check whether they're compatible. And if they're not compatible, then it's unconstitutional. There's an element of empiricism in that, but it's mostly deductive logic. Right? And that's very important for policy. Obviously, lawyers have a lot to do with policy, but not as much as I think kind of scientific expertise. And increasingly scientific expertise is what takes over. Then you've got a statement that's quite hot right now, something like Donald Trump has a 30% chance to win the election. These are the kind of statements that Nate Silver makes on a regular basis. I find these claims very weird. I don't think this is a falsifiable claim because the election only happens once. Repeat this statement as Donald Trump has a 50% chance to win the election. So it's a coin flip, right? The reason why we know that a coin flip is 50-50 is because when we flip a coin, a lot of times we notice that after 100 flips, it's roughly 50% tails and 50% heads, right? If we got a different distribution, we think this is an unfair coin. It's weighted in some way, right? But the key thing is we can only discern the probability properties of a particular phenomena, like the US election, if we repeat the roll, if we take multiple draws, if we flip the coin multiple times, if we roll the dice many times. Because the election only happens once, you don't know what his likelihood is of winning, right? If he doesn't win, then you can say, oh, well, that was the 70% chance that Clinton had to win or Biden had to win or whatever it might be. And if he does win, then you say, oh, well, see, our model had him at 30%, whereas the HuffPost model only had him at 3%, and therefore our model is correct. But that's not right either, because it's possible that this was just the 3% chance that the HuffPost model had calculated, right? And so this claim is not falsifiable, and so I think is kind of a pointless claim to make. Now, nonetheless, Nate Silver is someone who obviously knows a lot about the US electoral system in terms of the legal architecture, so he can make a lot of deductive statements. He's obviously someone who knows a lot about its history, so he can make claims like the Spanish flu one. He can do a lot of good punditry. He obviously knows a lot about statistics. He's obviously looking at all the polling. So I'd say Nate Silver is an expert, and I suspect that if we got Nate Silver to bet on election outcomes against everyone else who likes to predict election outcomes, over the course of many elections, Nate Silver would come out on top. And I think that kind of tells you that this guy is an expert. Like he has knowledgeable, he can make falsifiable claims in the sense that he's like, I will bet you that this is going to happen. Yeah. All right. So anyway, there's some interesting nuances there in probabilistic claims. The last one is, I think, the one that's most relevant to public policy circumstances, which is something like lockdowns of a certain variety will reduce COVID-19 transmission at a certain rate. This is an empirical claim, it's falsifiable with data, and it's predictive, right? You are saying, I reckon we should do this because it will reduce this thing that we're concerned about reducing at a particular rate, right? Okay, so that's the kind of claim that I think we associate with expertise. That's what the doctor's about. The doctor says, if you take these pills, you will feel better after a week, right? Okay, and they're usually right, and so we trust doctors, yeah? Okay, now prediction, I think, is worth spending a little bit of time on. So empirical claims and predictive claims are slightly different, and prediction is very, very tricky, right? So in a lot of cases, someone who seems to be an expert because they've constantly or repeatedly predicted things correctly might have actually just gotten lucky several times in a row. So you think of someone like Simon Cowell, the X Factor judge. He's an expert on commercially successful music, but it's possible that Simon Cowell just got lucky repeatedly, and now he has this kind of momentum where whoever Simon Cowell picks becomes famous because they were picked by Simon Cowell, not because they're actually kind of really genuinely commercially viable. And this same sort of luck issue can be said for successful brokers, industrialists, artists, pollsters, academics, a whole bunch of people, even athletes. So this individual is Stephen Bradbury, Australian folk legend, who's a speed skater. Australians are not known for winter sports, but Stephen Bradbury qualified for the Olympics, and then in the heats, all his opponents in the race fell over. And so he coasted through to the finals, and then in the finals, all his opponents again fell over, and he became the gold medalist by default. So it seems like, can we say that Stephen Bradbury is an expert because he has a gold medal like Shane Warne with all his amazing records in cricket? Or is it just the case that Stephen Bradbury got lucky? If you're interested in these sort of themes, I think Nassim Taleb's work is by far and away the most accessible and also extremely powerful and insightful on this sort of stuff, especially his early books, so Fooled by Randomness and The Black Swan. More recently, he's gotten into kind of policy-related stuff in Anti-Fragile, and then even more recently into morality with Skin in the Game. All good books, all very readable once you kind of get used to the fact that Taleb is just incredibly arrogant. But it's kind of entertaining once you let that wash over you. Now, this kind of tendency to mistake luck for predictive ability is kind of a form of survivor bias. So survivor bias is when you look at what has lasted through a process and try to learn from that, rather than looking at who has failed and why and trying to learn from that. So the kind of iconic example of survivor bias was airplane engineers in World War II, looking at planes that had come back from bombing missions and the like, and trying to assess where they should armor these planes and where they should try to protect them so that they would survive these missions. And that's what this picture kind of refers to. So you're looking at a plane and it's just full of holes from flak cannons and that sort of thing. And they're looking at this plane and they say, wow, the wings are just shot to pieces. We really need to armor the wings so that these planes survive longer. And the reason why that's a biased assessment or incorrect assessment certainly is that you're looking at the planes that have made it back, and the planes that have made it back have holes in the wings. What that tells you is that even with holes in the wings, you'll still come back. What you should be looking at is the planes that didn't make it back. And guess where they've probably been shot? The engines, because none of the planes that have come back have holes in the engines. All the planes with holes in the engines crashed and burned. Okay, so it's the same sort of thing here. Maybe we should be looking at what it was about the people that didn't manage to pick several winners in terms of commercially successful music, or didn't manage to pick election winners or whatever it might be. What were their features that inhibited their predictive ability? Now, a key observation as well is that the more times you roll the dice, the more times you make a predictive claim, the more chances there are that you will be revealed to be a fraud or at least incorrect in your assessments. So we want to put more stock in people that have had more rolls of the dice and been correct more often. All right. What about, so then a few other points on this notion of predictive ability versus luck. It's just compounded by a tendency in our society to reward success. I think one of the most profound statements in the Bible is this line from Matthew: to those that have, more shall be given. And I feel this very acutely in my own life. So I'm got very lucky recently with a postdoc at Cambridge University. Now that I'm at Cambridge, funding is easier and I'm kind of more high profile and prestigious. And so I get more media appearances. I write more impressive papers because I have the funding. I get invited to give more seminar talks, which exposes me to editors and more criticism, and I can get more feedback. And all this just kind of makes me more successful and compounds that initial luck that I had of getting into Cambridge, where a equally talented scholar who got into somewhere like Warwick or Leeds University or Liverpool or something like that just faces a much more of an uphill battle to get the same kind of exposure. So, I mean, what's the kind of inference from this? Should we just not put much stock in predictions? I don't think that's true. Predictions are an inevitable part of policymaking, but where possible, we should get our people who are making predictions to have skin in the game. This is Taleb's main kind of moral argument. So Nate Silver should be betting on all his polling claims. And anyone else who's making comments about macroeconomics and the like should be making bets. Now there's often, and that way, if they got it wrong, they'll get burned more than anyone else. This is the idea of the Babylonian bridge builders. So in ancient Babylon, supposedly, bridge builders were quite well paid members of society, high status, but a key thing was that they had to live under the bridges that they had built. So if they built a shoddy bridge, it would collapse on their family first. So this kind of idea is quite powerful, but is often difficult. I mean, we would not want the Federal Reserve Board to be invested in the share market because that would give them a conflict of interest. So it's often hard to operationalize this insight. All right. This was one of the pictures that I came across in my Google search for images to do with wisdom and experience and expertise and stuff. And I was like, what is this? And I clicked on it, and it was the Winds of Wisdom buff from World of Warcraft, which gives you 100% experience bonus. And I thought, well, this would be a good segue to talk about experience. So what's the role of experience in expertise? Well, remember that the more times you roll the dice, the more likely you are to crap out if your claims are wrong. So people with a lot of expertise have essentially rolled the dice many times. And this is why historically in human history, we have relied on elders as a repository of wisdom. Not only because they have all this oral history, but mostly just because they've been around a long time. And so they've seen multiple instances of rare phenomena. If something occurs only every 15 years, then someone who's 75 will have already seen it 5 times, right? Is that right? I hope that's right. Yeah, 5 times. I know maths. Right. Whereas a young gun who, the head of the tribe might be in their late 20s, early 30s because they're a really good warrior or something, but they just don't have that kind of experience. So you rely on the elders for that. Today, we've kind of really devalued this sort of experience from lifetime knowledge, and we hope that our assembled knowledge from replicated scientific findings can replace the wisdom of our elders. And that's increasingly true because we can access that knowledge so fast using our computational methods and our databases and all this kind of stuff. But we still emphasize experience where instinct is really important and where evidence is thin. So particularly, say, military decision-making under pressure, or something like pastoral care where there's a lot of nuances and it's very hard to do kind of controlled studies, there we again really emphasize experience. But remember that experience is also full of survivor bias, so we've got to be careful. All right, still setting the scene, I want to move on now to wisdom for a bit, which is going to be an absolutely critical concept as we move into public policy. And I think wisdom, in the way I mean it for the context of this talk, is really well captured in this iconic line from Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park. Your scientists were so preoccupied about whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. So could and should, that's the key thing. And the difference here is between empirical claims and knowledge, that's whether you can, and you can have expertise in that sort of thing, and normative claims, which are not falsifiable, normative claims about whether you should. And this is a matter of wisdom, not knowledge, I would argue. All right, so the trouble with experts is that they often make out like their values are merely value neutral technical judgments, right? Technical judgments, not normative judgments. But of course, we've seen earlier, for example, we should have a gas-fired recovery. That's just my neutral technical judgment. But actually, it seems that experts are often sneaking in their value judgments into those kind of statements. The problem with politics, which compounds this, is that it's expeditious for political actors to present experts whose values align with their own. And so you get this phenomena, particularly accelerating from the late 80s onwards, where you say, oh, well, here is, Heather Boushey or Stephen Moore from this right-wing or left-wing think tank, sorry, other way around, Heather's left, Stephen Moore's right, funded by the same donors as our party, the Democrats or the Republicans, and they're going to explain to you, independent Senate committee, why we are right and you should do what we say. Of course, Heather is much better than Stephen, in my opinion, but that's kind of beside the point. So why is all this stuff relevant? Well, the reason why it's relevant is because it matters for rational policymaking, which is something that intuitively we think is desirable. And so what is rational policymaking? Like most arguments for greater expert involvement boil down to the claim that rational policymaking would be valuable. Rational policymaking is policymaking that's logical, that's sensible, that's reasonable. So for example, if you can build a bridge for $2 billion, or you can build the same bridge for $1 billion, then of course you should get the cheaper bridge because it's just as good, right? There's only two criteria: quality, cost. Well, if I can get the same quality for less cost, I should take the less costly one, right? That's only logical. That's what we mean by rational policymaking. Now, of course, things are more complicated than that in a lot of cases, but that's the essential idea. So the other way that it might happen is rational choice theory, which is basically like using behavioral models and various other kind of analytical frameworks developed by social scientists, overwhelmingly from economics, at least until very recently, to analyze and predict the costs and benefits of different policy options, and on the basis of that, suggest which one might be the best choice for government and the public. Now, the idea with technocracy or with rational public policy is just that some options are just obviously better than others. And if we empower experts, then it'll be clearer what these options are and we're more likely to select them over time. And this kind of leads to technocracy, which is rule by experts. It's different to epistocracy, which is ruled by educated people. Epistocracy is stupid. And I think there are a few things that make me write someone off faster than if they tell me that they're an epistocrat. Anyway, technocracy in some forms is a widespread feature of contemporary liberal democracies. We have expert oversight of domains where the means to a prescribed end involves knowledge of empirically falsifiable predictive claims. So central banks are the clearest example of that, perhaps, where the ends is keeping inflation low and within declared bounds. And we think that is a matter of kind of scientific expertise, that some people just know how to do that better than other people, and we should empower them to meet in the way that they think is best, according to their expertise, this prescribed end. Now, the ends themselves should ideally be decided democratically because they involve a value judgment and they are not a matter of science. Central banks are actually kind of ironic in this regard because the central kind of normative trade-off for central banks is between whether they should target minimizing unemployment or whether they should target minimizing inflation. And it's not like that debate was ever really put to a vote. It's just something that we've kind of muddled through to over the last few decades. As well as that, macroeconomic claims famously among economists are extremely difficult to falsify in a kind of uncontroversial or unchallengeable conclusive way, because it's very, very hard to do experiments in macroeconomics. So you can't like take two identical countries because you don't exist. Two identical countries do not exist, and you can't sort of give one a particular a financial crisis and not a financial crisis to the other one, or you can't give them both a financial crisis and vary how they respond to those circumstances. So we don't really have particularly great understanding epistemically of macroeconomic phenomena. In any case, central banks have been a wildly successful example of technocracy. I think we have had consistently low inflation for a very long time. There are some other criteria that we associate with technocracy in the contemporary world. So we typically reserve it only for areas of policy that involve genuinely complex technical issues that the public cannot be expected to understand in any sophisticated way, like nuclear power or pandemic response or energy market regulation, these kind of things. And we typically only get experts involved in analysis, not in decision-making. There are exceptions, of course, like regulators, for example, but typically they provide analysis, and then that analysis is an input into the public discourse, which then affects politics. So I thought I'd do a little bit of a discussion just on pro and against this kind of technocratic rational policymaking, in part because I personally used to be quite technocratic and quite sort of fond of that notion that we could improve the rationality of policymaking. And then in the last couple of years, I've very rapidly become extremely skeptical of it. And I still stand by a lot of the early work that I did in this space, but I've realized that there are many areas of policy where the kind of thinking that I was talking about is really unsuitable and genuinely dangerous. So this was the first book that I ever put out with Robert Bruning, my PhD supervisor, which is basically on the kind of logic of third way policymaking. So how to combine government and market in sophisticated ways to simultaneously promote equity and efficiency. And we even audaciously put beyond ideology in the title just to make our technocratic credentials really obvious. So what we argue in this book is basically what I said before, that there are just some areas of policy where there are policy options that are debated at the moment in politics that are just crap. They're not good answers to the policy problems. And that actually on a lot of social science and policymaking issues, we know a lot and we can tell you better options. Now, there are some cases where there are answers that are clearly just really good and we should implement those answers wherever possible. So for example, quota trading in the context of fisheries management is an exemplary way to run a fishery. It's really efficient, it's really sustainable, it maximizes biology and economics, and it provides a lot of equity and efficiency. And it's just much better than anything else you can do. Input regulations suck, catch limits without quota trading are not as efficient as catch limits with quota trading, and so on. So we should just implement this kind of approach. There's no reason to have any particularly thorough debate about it. You can empower a technocrat there to organize that system, and it will be superior to what else you have. In other areas, we at least know enough to be convinced that some policy options seem to be like pretty bad, for whatever ends we have in mind, and others seem to be slightly better. So for example, when we're thinking about trying to reduce poverty, in the past, we've used a lot of convoluted price controls, and both price floors and price ceilings and subsidies and other things that distort the market price in order to try to make things more affordable for poor people or easier to produce for struggling industry members. And this has resulted in a lot of dumb stuff like the butter mountains of the EU in the 1980s, where so much butter was produced, and butter was really expensive because there was a price control on it that made it artificially expensive. And so a lot of farmers produced butter because they thought they could make a lot of money, but then they couldn't sell it because no one wanted to buy it at that price. And so what happened, the government bought it, and then the government gave it to people in poverty who couldn't afford it. So for example, this pensioner here is getting a year's supply of butter in one go from the surplus. This just seems really inefficient, right? You're distorting prices all over the shop for an outcome that you could achieve just by giving cash transfers. So instead, you should just give these pensioners money and let them buy things at market prices. And we have analysed this fairly extensively, and this tends to be the better approach. Then there are other areas where we freely admit that we have no kind of first best solution and everything's just really hard and imperfect. But we'd still also point out that there are some things that we know don't work. One of my favorite examples in this is that in energy policy, notably in the UK, where I'm now a resident, there seems to be an endless debate about whether nationalising energy or privatising it is the best approach. And frankly, neither of these will do anything. The issue is that energy has a lot of natural monopoly dynamics, and neither privatization nor nationalization address that. The more sophisticated approaches like corporatization or sophisticated price controls have a lot of problems, but they're slightly better. In any case, we just waste heaps of time talking about stuff that definitely doesn't work. And then the last thing that's worth mentioning in this context is that the empirical turn in policy analysis since the 1990s, where we can do a lot of impact evaluations and very sophisticated kind of quasi-experimental assessments of whether things work or not, has revealed many policies at best do nothing if they're not actively harmful. And so we can just get rid of these policies. And this seems to me a very straightforward application of expertise that should be kind of uncontroversial. So I'll just give you one example. There was a program called Scared Straight, where they'd take delinquent youth who are at risk of falling into a life of crime and take them into maximum security jails to meet really like hardened criminals. And the idea was that these youths would be so terrified by this experience that they'd be scared straight and would no longer engage in their kind of delinquent semi-criminal behaviors. But after a bunch of these quasi-experimental, very sophisticated statistical analysis of these programs, it actually turns out that youth who are exposed to the Scared Straight interventions are more likely to engage in a life of crime thereafter. So these seem to have the opposite effect of what's intended, and getting rid of them is just a win for everybody. So I think this seems to me like a very straightforward example of how we can make policy more rational that doesn't involve any sort of complex value judgments or anything particularly controversial or political, right? It's just like, regardless of what you want, regardless of your preferred method, this particular method sucks and we should get rid of it. All right. So how can we use technocracy? How can I summarize this as like, what should we do with technocracy? So the basic idea is that we argue ideologically a lot over means rather than ends. And the reason why this is a bit silly is because the means are amenable to empirical testing. So we can falsify whether means work to the desired ends. What we can't falsify is the ends. And we should put most of our ideological debates into the ends space rather than the means. And in the means space, we should reserve our judgment and just do analyses and see what's working and what's not working. Of course, there are a lot of things to debate here about how the available means are prescribed. So for example, the technocratic approach at the moment tends to be very incrementalist, and a lot of people would say that many of our problems require really systematic change, which this approach kind of rules out. And so it's a form of power manifesting in technocracy, and I'll come to that in a moment. But in any case, I think there's plenty of scope to just reserve ideology for ends. And I guess an example of this is that we are endlessly relitigating the market versus government debates of the 1980s, perhaps because everyone in politics is in their 70s, rather than moving on to these more sophisticated hybrid policies in a lot of cases. I think basically it's helpful to have experts around in this kind of contexts to just exclude ideas that are definitely just bad and pointless from the policy debate and leave behind ideas that are viable. And then we can have a more efficient debate over viable options. And arguably the kind of debates between academics and think tanks and bureaucrats and media people should do this. And planning commissions like the Productivity Commission perform a similar function, but often governments are kind of ignoring this advice and it doesn't seem to cut through into the political process. I'm not entirely sure why that is. It might be because politicians are ignorant or the public's ignorant. It might be because these kind of ideas lack political cut through. So saying that, oh, we should privatize it or we should nationalize it just kind of really appeals to a lot of people's instinctive policy thinking, and some kind of mixed methods, sophisticated policy design is just a little bit too hard for them to wrap their head around. But more than that, it just doesn't have a kind of values-based resonance with people. It's also just really hard to sell complexity for that reason. Politicians can't explain complex policies particularly well to the pundits. And then there's also this problem of the politicization of science and expertise. So when a genuine technocrat comes along and says, "Oh no, like quota management methods for fisheries are the best," everyone's like, "You're full of shit. You're just paid off by the other side," right? Okay, but then there's this issue that I alluded to earlier, that maybe technocracy is itself just always a power grab, and this kind of notion that I have that some things are just obviously dumb and should be gotten rid of is really just a covert power grab on my part as a representative of the technocracy. So consider, for example, healthcare. So because of market failures of information like moral hazard and adverse selection, healthcare is usually considered something where free markets are just definitely not going to provide an efficient or equitable outcome. And we have mountains of empirical evidence for this now. Like, I do not think this is contested among economists. But there are still good uses for markets in mixed systems. And I won't get into that here, but if you're interested, you can read our book. Nonetheless, despite this kind of overwhelming technical consensus, there is still a lot of opposition to kind of socialized forms of healthcare, particularly among Americans, even among those Americans who recognize these market failures of information. And that's because they argue that there's one thing missing from the economic analysis, namely particular political rights, specifically the right not to subsidize other people. And this kind of libertarian argument that young and healthy people shouldn't have to subsidize the healthcare costs of old and sick people. Now, there's nothing in the economic way of analyzing policy that can account for these kind of rights-based claims. So they're just missing from the analysis. And it might be that when technocrats come in and they say, well, we should use a kind of single payer or kind of high public based healthcare system, they're really just kind of sneaking in their preferences by not including these kind of rights-based arguments in their analysis. The cost of that is really enormous. The US just spends colossal amounts on healthcare relative to everyone else because it's the only country that relies so heavily on healthcare markets, and so it suffers all these inefficiencies associated with those market failures, but maybe it's worth it. Rights-based people tend to be quite absolutist about their principles, and no cost is too high. It might also just be that the US polity is really stupid. I mean, a lot of people there seem to, not the US polity, just people are dumb. There's this great quote from Winston Churchill, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. I find I'm very pro-democracy, and I think if we lose the average voter, it's the technocracy who's stuffed up. But there is reason to be demoralized. Like, you see a lot of this sort of stuff in US rallies where keep government out of my Medicare. But of course, Medicare is socialized medicine, and it doesn't help that a lot of these kind of claims against socialized medicine in Medicare involve a lot of spelling errors and this kind of stuff. It might also be the case that my claim that there's this sort of academic consensus around stuff is erroneous. So, for example, there's this big debate a few years ago in the Indian media, at least, between the kind of Bhagwati camp of greater liberalization of the Indian economy versus the Sendreze account of kind of more emphasis on subsidies and transfers and various other programs that were arguably a bit inefficient, but maybe worth it to assist the poor. And it's funny, this debate, because the academics kind of all mostly agreed with each other, and it was sort of minor matters of disagreement. But the media really blew it up to be like, oh, all these like really high profile people like deeply disagree with each other. And this wasn't really true. Anyway, what then again against rational policymaking? So I've mostly been talking in favor of it. What about against it? So the idea here, or I think the main argument against technocracy, is that rational policymaking implies that we take the most efficacious means towards desired ends. But then who chooses the ends, right? So if the technocrats are choosing the ends, that's not an expert activity, that's just a value judgment, right? And so in a liberal democracy, typically we think that the public should make those kind of decisions, not paternalistic technocrats. There's also a lot of cases in public policy analysis where both the ends and the means are value-laden. So in the case of COVID and these supposed health and economics trade-offs, we see that economists and epidemiologists, in bringing what they believe to be sort of judgment-free, neutral models for analyzing different outcomes in public policy, are actually bringing value judgments that are embedded in those models. So if my epidemiology model is mostly about how can I get deaths down, then there's an implicit valuation of deaths in there as being the kind of most important thing. And if I, as an economist, bring in a model that's all about kind of reducing costs, then again, it seems that that's my implicit valuation. And while economists are trying to count everything, so we have the statistical value of a life and this sort of stuff, there's plenty of reasons to think that these valuations are full of values, not just a kind of dry technical analysis. Then you get some areas where and they're really inextricable democratic and technocratic issues. So in well-being, which is my main area of expertise, it's very hard to claim expertise about well-being because well-being is a value judgment inherently. You're saying this is what's good for somebody. You can only define well-being by making a value judgment. So when you say I'm an expert in it, what you're really an expert in is a particular value judgment that you like. So this is an example of that in the public policy space around well-being. So this is quite a high-profile book by a range of academics across Europe, where they argue that public expenditure, taxation, regulation, and all sort of public policy issues should increasingly be based on evidence about how they affect the subjective well-being of the people. And they argue that life satisfaction should be the sole measure of well-being, and that cost-benefit analysis should be applied to maximize subjective well-being. And they claim that this is a democratic approach. Why is this problematic? Well, it's like, well, what is well-being? I mean, this is not a term that we cannot identify the definition of this term through empirical investigation because the term itself requires a value judgment. It's not something like heat or intelligence even. It's even more value-laden than those kind of terms. And so these scientists are essentially making a value judgment, and that's fine. There's topics that they're interested in. They say this is well-being as far as we're concerned, and we're going to do empirical research on that. But there are other scientists and other citizens who have different definitions of well-being and are also doing a bunch of research on that. So for example, midwives might focus on baby birth weight. Economists and liberals tend to focus on whether you can satisfy your preferences. Christians focus on whether society is godly and whether people are living in a Christian way. Development studies tends to focus on basic needs and capabilities. Psychiatrists tend to focus on mental health. It's like all these people have different ways of thinking about well-being. Why should we emphasize this life satisfaction measure above all the things that they're interested in? And that's not a purely technical discussion. That's very much a value-laden discussion. And so it's something that we need to have democratic instruments involved in. Shifting from one context, like the kind of laboratory context that a lot of these subjective well-being researchers operate in, to another context, like policy, involves a shift in the relevant stakeholders. And so you need to appreciate all the different value judgments that those new stakeholders are going to be bringing to the context that you're working in. And I don't get the sense that that's really true in a lot of this literature. Life satisfaction is always presented as a kind of value-neutral, scientific, sterile concept. And that really, I think, whether it's intentional or not, amounts to sneaking in one group's preferred value judgments over everyone else's. And this is particularly sneaky when you claim that other people's perspectives aren't about well-being, only yours is. So for example, economists typically use income equivalent methods of understanding relative well-being trade-offs. And that's because income is a reasonably good proxy for preference satisfaction, which is what they think well-being is. And so you say, oh, we shouldn't use GDP because that's not about well-being. We should focus on well-being. But as far as most neoclassical economists are concerned, GDP is a reasonably good measure of quite a very philosophically sophisticated understanding of well-being that's embedded in that preference satisfaction account. And it's also sketchy because the sort of supposed democratic aspect of this is really quite sketchy in research practice. So the idea is that when people assess their life satisfaction, they can decide what's valuable to them. And on the basis of what's valuable to them, they can give you this number, their life satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 10, where 8 out of 10 means very happy, right? And the problem with that is the researchers then take that number and put it on the left-hand side of a regression equation, and they populate the right-hand side with variables that they, the researchers, think are relevant to people's subjective well-being. We never ask the citizens themselves what they think. And there are good research reasons for that. They might give us socially desirability biased responses and so on. But there's a difference, again, between the research context and the policy context. In the policy context, we need to let the citizens make the value judgments, and that's not what happens here. So this seems to me to be an exceedingly technocratic way of doing this, not a democratic way of making these judgments. And then finally, it's sketchy because measuring well-being itself involves value judgments. So if anyone is familiar with psychometric methods, you often have to make value judgments about what well-being means in the context of psychometric validation, which means that your psychometric scale is itself not a kind of value judgment-free instrument. And so the basis of expertise, which is falsifiable claims, is value laden. Right? So in these kind of circumstances, I think policy can only proceed through a kind of co-production design where experts and citizens work together on authoring a whole lot of stuff. All right, let's turn now to COVID for the last part of this talk. So the main theme of this talk has been really about technical versus value judgments and how that manifests in expertise. So there's obviously a bunch of value judgments in COVID. What's the value of a life? What's the value of mental health as it declines in lockdown? What's the value of solidarity with healthcare workers versus freedom to do my own thing? What's the value of the lost human capital of kids who are pulled out of school? Who's going to get a vaccine first? That's a very heavy value judgment. And then there's obviously a whole bunch of technical judgments too. What's the infection rate going to be? How fast are people going to die? How many ventilators do we have? What's the capacity of the healthcare system, etc. Another key thing about the COVID situation for expertise is that it's very urgent and it's extremely technically complex, right? So you need experienced experts and there's no time for normative deliberation. The problem for this kind of thing is that a lot of the expert judgments that are being made in the context of COVID are based on very thin evidence, right? So there's not really a sense that you have knowledge about falsifiable claims because we've never really made these falsifiable claims before. So for example, in the early stages of lockdown 1, there was a lot of concern that lockdown would be quite bad for people's mental health. There are a lot of rapid reviews of the evidence in very high profile journals like The Lancet, and these reviews were done very well. And they were very concerned about mental health effects based on the limited literature that we had on quarantine and isolated confinement and these kind of things. But I have a paper with some colleagues at Cambridge where we show that mood, which is quite closely related to mental health, it turns out, really improved under lockdown. So you can see from this graph that in March, when the pandemic gets started and people are really worried about COVID, people's moods absolutely tank. They just totally fall off a cliff there, right? And then as lockdown comes in, almost immediately, we see a huge reversion. And our suspicion is that this is because people are really kind of calmed by this dramatic response from the government. Like something's being done, you don't need to worry about the pandemic, just got to lock it down and we'll be all right. So maybe those early rapid reviews of evidence were erroneous and we didn't need to worry about it in our expert judgments. But that might not be true either, because as with a lot of things in research, it's complicated. The research that I just showed you there is based on quite a large sample of several hundred Brightons measured daily. But it's a population average. It gives you a decent sense for the British population overall, but it's not big enough for us to isolate particular subgroups that you might be interested in, particularly those people with pre-existing mental health conditions. And other studies that have focused specifically on those people seem to find that they are having a really bad time under COVID. It's also not clear whether the second lockdown is going to be the same as the first lockdown and so on. So like we have all this new evidence coming up, but it's not clear how much that can inform our falsifiable predictions. But there's still some reasons to be optimistic on this front, I think. So we're learning heaps. COVID has seen, I think, has demonstrated the ability of the kind of expert community to rapidly rally around important research questions and crank out answers at a rapid pace. And the 3 vaccines that we now have in the space of less than a year are, I think, an amazing demonstration of our capacity to get shit done. So data gathering has been really rapid and really effective. So UCL's COVID social survey is a great example of that. They got that done in a few weeks. Now it's collecting data weekly, tens of thousands of people, really high quality data. And that's resulting in weekly government reports. We've had very rapid dissemination of research. So new journals have been established by leading journals. They've got separate COVID journals now. Then we've also got COVID journals that don't mind if you then repost the paper in a second journal that's more prestigious, but the COVID journal is set up to rapidly disseminate COVID-based papers. Journals have kind of hired extra reviewers just to focus on COVID stuff because of the urgency. And then we've also seen innovations in peer review. So this book, Economics in the Age of COVID by Josh Gans, was, as I understand it, kind of written live. So as he was writing chapters, he would put them up, and the chapters would be peer reviewed in real time while he was writing other stuff. So it was fully transparent. His publishers could see whether he was talking nonsense as he was going on, like whether people were ripping on him and whether he was integrating those comments as he was going through. And so as soon as the book was done, it was published. There was no need to kind of really wait for a year while it went through peer review, which is usually how long it takes, at least, for a book to go through peer review. So we had these innovations that allowed things to happen faster. And some of those findings, at least, have been quite rapidly integrated by governments into their response, which I think is quite encouraging. This might then lead to this question that I think a lot of people are wondering about is, will COVID be the revenge of the experts? Experts have been maligned a lot in the kind of populist uprising of the last 10 years or so. Maybe now they'll kind of resume their prominence, with everyone realizing that, there's a lot of questions that are just too hard for your average Joe Blow in the streets to have an opinion about. Unfortunately, I think, well, maybe it's fortunate, I don't know. I guess I have my biases. I would say, unfortunately, this is unlikely to be the case. There's a new paper by Eichengreen, Saka, and Aksoy that you can get for free off the MBR. I've given the link here, or it's forthcoming in the Journal of Political Economy, which is one of the top journals in economics, where they combine data from the Wellcome Trust and data on global epidemics the last 50 years or so. And they find that exposure to an epidemic has no impact on trust in science as an endeavor, but significantly reduces trust in scientists and belief in their value. And that decline in trust is sadly driven by individuals with little previous training in science subjects. And that distrust translates into lower compliance with health-related policies, in particular vaccines, which is a real upcoming battle that the kind of public health architecture is going to face as we roll out the COVID vaccine. Because if, as it seems, perhaps only 67% of people are willing to get vaccinated, that's not really going to be enough for herd immunity. All right, last couple of slides here on some hopeful note to finish on. Is there some way to integrate normative and technical expertise in public policy so that we can surmount some of these issues that I've been raising about wisdom versus knowledge? So one thing that we've been trying in the last 15, 20 years or so is deliberative mechanisms. So when you have a lot of time, which we don't have under COVID, you can use deliberative mechanisms to get normative input from citizens into technical decision making. So some of the examples here, mini public, citizens, juries, this kind of thing, they're all kind of the same. Basically, the idea is that experts have their big kind of technical architecture. They might have a model for thinking about how they're going to respond to a pandemic. But there's a lot of value judgments to be made in that model, like who should get vaccines first. And the experts can't make that judgment. So once they've got the model, they then get 30 citizens who are hopefully representative of the population in some way, or with the numbers that these things have, they're very rarely representative. And they sit with those citizens for a week, or for quite a few days usually, and really explain to them all the technical issues that are kind of involved and where they need normative input. And then on the basis of that education and deliberation with those experts and among themselves, the citizens report what they think are the kind of reasonable value judgments. And these have been used, interestingly, for pandemic response. And I was not able to find to what extent this stuff was integrated during COVID, but I suspect it was. The problem with these mechanisms is that they're very expensive and quite unwieldy, like they're logistically challenging to arrange, and quality control is very difficult. We really haven't done a lot of evidence for what types of deliberative mechanisms work better than others and what sort of practices you need, including just things like, should you have 6-hour days, 3 days is enough, how should you communicate, this kind of stuff. Another option is co-production, which I'm involved in a project on at the moment. And these are particularly relevant to areas of policymaking that are just riven with value judgments, like well-being. So you can't have a technical architecture that you just plug normative values into. The value judgments need to come first and need to be continuously made throughout the process. So co-production involves working with different expert groups. So you have your academic experts who are experts in the logic, the statistics, these kind of things related to an area. Then you have your professional experts who are the stakeholders who are going to use whatever policy comes out of this research. So these could be your street level bureaucrats, for example, or your statistical authorities. And then you have your lived experts, the people who are directly affected by the policy, and they're the ones who have the relevant value judgments that you want to take into consideration. Now, some areas this is really hard. Like if you're talking about people who are like, we're working with people in financial hardship who are facing poverty and getting welfare payments, they have their lived experience, their value judgments, but maybe we'll be disregarding the taxpayer who funds a lot of this. Maybe we should get them involved a bit more. But that would make things very unwieldy. So that leads to the problems with this approach, which is that it's expensive, it's unwieldy, it's time consuming, it's very difficult to scale up, it's unrepresentative, it's very hard to generalize, and so on. It's got a lot of problems, but early days, and we'll keep working on it. And then the last thing that I thought I'd mention is that we're getting much better at what you might call high frequency normative polling. So I mentioned earlier University College London's COVID-19 social survey. Basically, they used a snowballing sampling method, which is where you just put ads out on Facebook and through personal networks and stuff to say, join the survey. And then people just pile in because they're interested. I don't even think they get paid in this one. It's just a volunteer information. And then as more and more people come in and you do these emailing things, and eventually they ended up with a sample of over 100,000 people, I think. And then you stratify that. So you drop people from the sample until you have a sample that is representative for the British population or the UK population, and you do your analysis on that basis. This kind of method relies on citizen engagement, which is a weakness, but also a strength in that it tends to build trust, it builds solidarity, it builds interest among the public, makes them feel like they're empowered, they're invested in the policy decisions, this kind of stuff. This social survey in particular produces weekly data on a range of COVID-related stuff around employment and health and fear and all the rest of it, but also on value judgments around like who people think should get vaccines first and this kind of thing. And the authors of this study, and in particular Daisy Fancourt, just because I know her a bit, make weekly reports to government, which is, I think, quite impressive, not something that would have happened even 100 years ago. All right. That's the end of my talk. I hope it was stimulating and interesting. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. You can find my email on the Bennett Institute for Public Policy website at the University of Cambridge. Thanks very much. How do I stop the recording?